So now we have Cecile Molinier, who is the director at the UNDP office in Geneva. Ms. Molinier is the current director of the UNDP office. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in English from the Sorbonne in Paris and a Master's degree in English Literature from Queen Mary's College in London. Before joining the UNDP, Ms. Molinier was a lecturer at Smith College in Massachusetts. She then moved to work for the UN Secretariat, where she held a number of positions, including Special Assistant to the Director General for Development and International Economic Cooperation. From this position, Ms. Molinier moved to the UNDP in 1992, first as Deputy Resident Representative in Tunisia, shortly followed by assignments in Sao Tome and Principe, Togo and Mauritania, before assuming the role of Director at the UNDP office in Geneva. Throughout her career, Ms. Molinier has contributed to the achievement of national development objectives in strategic areas such as community-based management of natural resources, environmental protection, poverty reduction, and capacity development, mobilization against HIV/AIDS, and supported processes of democratization. So, ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Cecile Molinier.
Well, thank you very much, and I hope you did not find this introduction too long. I'm going to try and focus on the topic of today's discussion. And actually, I think both Dr. Supachai and Mr. Yersa made some very, very interesting points. And what I'm going to try to show is how, from our point of view as UNDP, which is a field-based organization with presence in a number of countries and approximately 85% of our resources at country level, how can we show that it is actually possible to integrate the economic, social, and environmental strands of sustainable development and to actually show some examples that it is already working. Of course, all of this being placed very much in the context of Rio +20, but not forgetting that the whole development community, or even beyond that, the whole international community has been working since 2000 within the framework of the Millennium Development Goals. And how do we move from the Millennium Development Goals to Sustainable Development Goals? How do we start reflecting on what could be the post-2015 framework that will bring together different endeavors from the different members of the international community? And I would like to add right up front that we are convinced that in addition to, or together with, the environmental, social, and economic strands of sustainable development, we should also very much think about the cultural component, let's say, of sustainable development. I think it was interesting earlier on to hear both Mr. Dunfried and the two previous speakers share their views on how they see cultural diversity. As we say at the UN, cultural diplomacy being maybe one of the ways of approaching cultural diversity, how that is also an underpinning and a prerequisite for implementing sustainable development in practice. A lot of what I'm going to say is derived from an interesting publication that we released very recently in the context of our contribution to Rio +20. So if you allow me to do a little bit of publicity for UNDP, you will find it on our website, www.undp.org, and it has a bit of a lengthy title, Case Studies of Sustainable Development in Practice, Triple Wins for Sustainable Development. But you will find other publications on our website, our reports, other reports which are equally relevant. Now, our perspective on how the negotiations for Rio +20 have evolved and how they are leading to what I think we can call reduced expectations vis-à-vis the deliverables to be expected from Rio. And I think Dr. Supachai, very eloquently put it, is that we've been going through through a number of iterations of a draft of a final declaration of Rio, starting with an initial zero draft, which was very much centered on the environmental pillar or strand of sustainable development. It was all very green in color and in examples and in recommendations. And then, once the member states got into the gist of a negotiation, it was interesting to note how there was a very, very strong push for poverty reduction, which could be presented as more of the economic and social strands of sustainable development, with, of course, a very strong reference to the Millennium Development Goals and the need to not to forget that we are not yet in 2015, not to forget that there was a very interesting summit that took place in 2010 at the UN with a declaration that is in fact action-oriented and very focused on what needs to be done to accelerate achievement of the MDGs. So in the ongoing incipient, if I may say, reflection on sustainable development goals, it is extremely important to build upon and to complement and to strengthen the MDGs, bearing in mind that the MDGs have a great strength, which is that they are not only fully integrated, which is very important in itself and mutually reinforcing, but also that they are clear, and that they are focused and they are easily measurable and monitorable because they translate into targets and indicators. So one of the challenges in developing sustainable development goals will be to arrive at goals that are also clear, that are also focused, and that are also measurable. Why is it important that they should be measurable? Because, of course, that brings in the dimension of accountability. One of the interesting dimensions, I would say, of underlying principles of the Sustainable Development Goals, and what we, if I may be as immodest as speaking on behalf of the UN, what we hope to get from Rio, but the Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said it very clearly a few days ago, is at least an agreement upon among member states on the underlying principles that will underpin those sustainable development goals. And one of them is that they are applicable to all countries. Now, that's a significant change from the MDGs, which, as you know, the first 7 of them are monitored in developing countries, and the 8th applies to the Global Partnership for Development, which means essentially to developed countries. Now, it would be really a very interesting paradigm shift to have agreement among all member states that we should agree on goals that apply to all countries, and there no longer is such a clear divide between quote-unquote developed and quote-unquote developing countries. I think, Mr. Yerxa from the WTO, the question you asked on the BRICS and what we see happening in a context of globalization and the changing balances of power shows very clearly that it doesn't make any sense anymore to talk about developed and developing. We should also try, and that's an important point made by the UN, to measure developments not anymore in terms of GDP per capita. Now, as you probably know, in 1990, UNDP came out with the first Human Development Report and the definition of a Human Development Index that takes into account not only a measurement of economic growth measured by GDP per capita, but also variables that are linked to health and education as being very significant components of human development. And through those 22 years since our initial report, we have refined the Human Development Index considerably by including dimensions related to gender, related to equity and sustainability. And I would say our contribution to Rio +20, as expressed in last year's Human Development Report and its title on equity, sustainability, prosperity and a better future for all, indicates what our focus is vis-à-vis Rio and more broadly the discussions on sustainable development goals and the post-2015 framework. It is that one of the ambitions of the international community should be to reduce significantly inequities, which, as was shown by the previous speakers, in a context of overall significant economic growth, at the same time inequity has increased. And why is that? And what can be done precisely to remedy those growing gaps and disparities? And that is very much at the heart of what sustainable development is. So in our view, and you will find, of course, more details and more illustrations in this report or in shorter documents you could find on our website, but sustainable development is at the intersection, and that's why we like to speak of the three strands of sustainable development, rather than the three pillars, because it's very difficult to interweave pillars. You know, pillars are like this, but strands you can interweave. So think of three circles that intersect. You have economic growth, you have social protection, and you have environmental sustainability. Now, the green economy is at the intersection of the economic growth and environmental sustainability. Inclusive growth, which is very much part of our mandate, is at the intersection of economic growth and social protection. And where those three circles intersect, right in the middle, this is where you find sustainable development, and where we show already, based on research and good practices at country level, that it is possible to arrive at what we call triple win solutions. Of course, those triple win solutions are not that many yet. They need to be analyzed, they need to be refined, and they need to be scaled up. But it is already there. And it is important to know that it is already there. And we very much hope that the discussions before, during, and after Rio will very much focus on the search for those triple win solutions. An important element also is, and one of the very positive factors of that whole preparation for Rio, and I would say strongly influenced by the Brazilian government and by the leadership of the current president, but also of her predecessor, is that even more than the dialogue that took place 20 years ago at Rio, it is very much a multi-stakeholder and a multi-level dialogue. And I don't know to what extent you've been following what is going on and looking at the different dialogue platforms, but if you haven't, I would very much suggest that you take time to do that. You will see in particular a platform that was launched very recently, which you will find at www.riodialogues, in one word, dialogues in the plural, .org, and where you will see the richness and the variety of the other discussions, of the concerns expressed, of the solutions that are being recommended. There are what we call major groups that are actively participating in the preparation of Rio. One of the points that we are, as UNDP, making, but a number of member states are also making, is that it would be important for the major groups to be more than just precisely major groups that discuss, within their major groups, and then will be allowed to bring their conclusions and recommendations to the discussions of the quote-unquote big players, but that it would be very important to have the major groups actually participate in the discussions and in the negotiations as full-fledged participants. Now, this, as you can well imagine, raises a number of issues among the member states themselves, a number of which are somewhat reluctant to discuss on an equal footing with civil society, community-based organization, with a private sector, even with local and subnational authorities that are actively gearing up for Rio. But unless there is a way to find either a platform or a type of dialogue that brings in those different levels and perspectives on the discussions on sustainable development, whatever will come out of Rio will not be very sustainable because there will not be the buy-in of those different stakeholders who are absolutely essential in developing and in implementing whatever not only comes out of Rio, but whatever comes out of the subsequent discussions on sustainable development goals and on the post-2015 framework. I assume you know that the Secretary General has appointed very recently a high-level panel co-chaired by David Cameron, by Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, and by President Widodo of Indonesia, precisely to advise him and through him the international community on those sustainable development goals. So maybe, because we don't have too much time, and I would be more than happy to answer questions that you may have, to give you a concrete example of what sustainable development is already in practice and how to make it happen. You will probably not be surprised that I take Brazil as an example. And why Brazil? Because actually in Brazil, since 2003, and starting with the presidency of Lula and moving on with the presidency of Dilma Rousseff, political leadership at the very highest level, combined with a multi-stakeholder approach and a very strong involvement of civil society, community-based organizations, and the private sector, focusing on developing new policies that are people-centered, starting with a paradigm of human development. By the way, when our first national human development report came out after the 1990 Global Human Development Report, it was done precisely in Brazil. And what it showed is that in 1990, within the overall measurement of human development in Brazil, you found glaring and very worrisome inequalities among regions of Brazil, within regions, among different groups of the population. And it was actually the starting point of a very stimulating discussion between the government of Brazil at that time, so well before Lula, because Lula took power in 2003. Already at that time, Brazilian authorities at all levels were very much aware of a potential risk of social instability and slowdown of economic growth because of the glaring disparities within the country and among different social strata. So those policies have to be people-centered, and of course the aim is to reduce inequalities and to contribute at the same time to sustain economic growth, inclusive growth, and build the country which it is, with huge areas of biodiversity, with, as you know, a constant threat of illegal logging and exploitation of those natural resources. How to do that while at the same time protecting and repleting the biodiversity of Brazil. All of that being done at different levels. Brazil is a federal state, so at the federal level, but at the level of each and every state and within the states of the districts and the communities. And how to address simultaneously the multiple dimensions of poverty, because what we showed in our human development report last year is that poverty is multidimensional. It is income poverty, but it is also lack of opportunities and choices. It is lack of access to and affordability of basic social services. And those gaps, those lacks, those lacunae, if I may say so, are unfortunately mutually reinforcing. And you will find that the worst dimensions of poverty are to be found in countries where people precisely do not have access to clean energy, do not have access to education, to social services, and do not have access to food security. And this is the case, of course, in a number of areas of Brazil, but also in other countries. And just to give you very quickly, and I will conclude, a few figures, thanks to those policies started in the early 2000s through an integrated program, which is well known, called Bolsa Familia, but Bolsa Familia accompanied with other complementary country, initiatives such as Fome Zero to address the challenge of hunger and malnutrition, such as, and let me get the Brazilian titles right, Luz para Todos, which means access to energy in rural areas, Agua para Todos, access to safe water and sanitation, Bolsa Verde, which is a program of subsidies to small-scale and family landholders in rural areas and in protected areas, precisely to provide them with incentives not to deplete natural resources forward, and a very significant program of renewable energies. The figures that we have for the research that we conducted in Brazil is that over a scope of between 1993 and 2009, income poverty decreased from 45 to 21 million people under the poverty threshold, and from 26 to 12 million people under the extreme poverty threshold, which is $1.25 a day. And equally important that the Gini coefficient, which measures inequality, decreased from 0.61 to 0.55. Those are significant figures. That infant mortality decreased from 50 to 17 per 1,000 live birth, maternal mortality from 120 to 58 per 100,000 live births, malnutrition from 11 to 6%, and that at the same time, access to safe drinking water increased from 89 to 98%, and improved sanitation from 68 to 79%. And all of that for a relatively low cost, because a lot of people are saying this is all well and good, but this is really very expensive. It's going to increase even further the debt, the national debt of a country, and how, can it be sustainable? Well, all of those measures, which have touched actually 1/3 of the Brazilian population, 13 million households and 30% of the population, all of that was done for 0.9% of public spending or 0.35% of GDP. So at a relatively low cost, but translating into very significant gains in economic growth, in access to social services and social protection, and also in environmental regeneration. Let me stop here, and if you have time, I'd be more than happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, Cecile Molinier. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah, once again, if you could keep your questions to 30 seconds and just briefly introduce yourself.
Thank you very much for the very interesting speech. Now, since it has been so successful in Brazil, this trial, is this going to be, or is it already become a manual for other countries to do the same? And as you said, the cost was surprisingly low. If 1/3 of the population has improved existence, so it would be very interesting to know what is the future of this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Karima from Morocco. I just have a generic question about the MDGs. Now we're talking about an extension of the MDGs package to 2025. Despite the few years campaigning about the MDGs, we still didn't reach the results that we have desired. In your opinion, what is not working, and do you think the current economic and financial crisis impacted the state's commitment to the MDGs? Thank you.
Akin Akiboye is my name, from University of Wageningen in the Netherlands. The question is, what is your view on sustainable development and post-conflict reconstruction within Africa in attaining the 2015 Millennium Goals? Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I just wanted to know what was the role of UNDP in this very interesting Brazilian experience. Thank you.
The Brazilian experience has been extensively documented, and we sense also very strong concern of the Brazilian government to ensure that Rio Plus 20 is not just another talk shop. Very much aware of a possible backlash of having 75,000 people, apparently that's the latest we heard, all congregating on Rio for that conference. So there have been discussions between the Brazilian government and the UN at the highest level, and including UNDP, which is part of my answer to Mr. Biro, about how to make this conference work. In other words, how to make sure that there are some concrete deliverables that are coming out of it. And one way to do that, and this is also what we did in 2010 for the MDG Summit, and this is one of the things we can do as UNDP, because we are in every country. We have a long-standing presence and a capital of trust that has been developed, not only with the governments, but with the different stakeholders in different countries, is to analyze what is happening at the country level, to extract from there a number of conclusions on what are precisely drivers of development, drivers of accelerated MDG growth, and to what extent it can be scaled up and replicated, because as we all know, each country has its own specific context, and it's extremely important not to think that Brazil can just document what it has done and plunk it into another country. Now, it's interesting to see that already within Latin America, there's a lot of interesting experiments being made. I would say, for example, that the Oportunidades program in Mexico is very clearly inspired by Bolsa Familia, but within the Mexican context. What we have done as UNDP, actually, beyond what I mentioned, which was really very important, starting a dialogue with the Brazilian authorities going back to 1990, and our first human development report that focused on inequality and gaps within a country, is to agree with them on setting up a center which is in Brasilia, which is called the IPCEG, which, if I'm not mistaken, stands for the International Policy Center on Inclusive Growth. And that center works precisely on analyzing, documenting experiences, not only the Brazilian experience, but experiences in social protection. One of the expected or possible outcomes of Rio would be to transform, to turn this center into a wider center that would be a global policy center on sustainable development, which could very well be in Rio and not in Brasilia. This is an idea, but just to show that one of the expected outcomes of Rio would be precisely to focus a lot on South-South and triangular cooperation. And again, to answer part of your question, Mr. Biro, UNDP has been actively supporting a number of countries that have interesting experiences to share on human development, and that would be interested in assisting other countries, sister countries, who have not reached the same level of human development or who may be facing some specific challenges. Of course, Brazil is very well known. All of the BRICS are very much working on a South-South and triangular cooperation basis. But beyond, those 5 countries, think of countries like Indonesia, Mexico, Argentina, Turkey, a very interesting, fast-moving countries. Qatar is very much interested also in promoting its own development models. So there's a whole very interesting dynamic of South-South and triangular cooperation, and this is one of our added value as UNDP, to offer a global platform where experts and practitioners can discuss, can share experiences, and agree on a number of common principles and recommendations. And this is actually what is happening on that famous Rio Dialogue platform that was open a little while ago. Now, on the MDGs and on the extension of the MDG, I will refer you again to interesting work that was done for the 2010 summit. And in particular, again, I apologize for quoting a UNDP report, but it was done at the request of the Secretary General and had a lot of impact on the discussions in 2010. It's called an international assessment of what it takes to achieve the MDGs. And what we did was we did some very in-depth analytical reviews of the MDG achievement in a number of countries. Beyond simply monitoring trends, we analyze precisely why, for example, take Ethiopia. Ethiopia has done tremendous strides in universal primary education. It is a very, very poor country. In a country like Ethiopia or Sao Tome and Principe, where I happened to work a number of years ago, they have reached the goal of universal primary education, and those are very poor countries. How did they achieve that? How did a country like Malawi achieve food security? So this is the kind of work we've done at the country level, and from there we extracted a number of common principles and drivers of accelerated achievement of the MDGs. One of them you'll be interested to hear is to invest a lot more than is being done already in women and girls education. Another one is access to energy for all. You know that one of the priorities of Secretary General Ban Ki-moon for his second term, but also for Rio, is the Sustainable Energy for All initiative. That could very well be a framework for the whole international community to agree on. And based on the research we have done, we know that access to energy not only, of course, improves the quality of life, but it enables better educational achievement, because a child that cannot read at night will have a lot of difficulty studying. It will improve also better access to social services and better health. And it will enable, for instance, women and girls to be able to engage more in income-generating activities instead of spending 5 hours a day, and in very dangerous conditions, very often, fetching wood. So those are, some examples of drivers. So my message is that, yes, all of the MDGs have not been achieved in all countries and will not be. But at the same time, it's very interesting to note that even in the poorest countries, some very significant achievements have taken place. And then your question, sir, about countries in conflict. The research we have done, and also together with the World Bank, very interestingly, on states in fragile situation and the achievement of the MDGs, you will not be surprised to hear that the countries where there has been least progress in achieving the MDGs are also the countries that have undergone long periods of instability, conflict, or for some of them, natural disasters. So there is clearly a correlation, a negative correlation between crisis, whether it is man-made or natural, bearing in mind that a number of natural disasters, by the way, are very often also, unfortunately, initially maybe caused or reinforced by man, and that there are ways to prepare better for natural disasters. So there is a negative correlation between crisis and achievement of the MDGs. There is obviously a negative correlation between crisis and instability and sustainable development. How to address that? It's very complex, because again, it's a mixture of political leadership or lack of political leadership, interference by a number of countries. But it's also one way to achieve it is to have a bottom-up, a very integrated and participatory approach, because the solution to crisis is to be found with the people themselves, the people who live in crisis. They also know very clearly what needs to be done to come out of that crisis, but very often they are not listened to sufficiently. So our approach would be to really go back to the community level and work as much as possible with community-based organizations. Thank you.
Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, Cecile Molinier.
Thank you.